Good morning, and thank you all for joining us at the Atlantic Council today. I'm Fred Kemp, President and CEO of the Council. Today, I have the honor to welcome you to this important debate on a key issue of American foreign policy, and that is how the U.S. Can best balance interests and values in its Russia policy. Yet behind that debate is a larger one that occupies us across the Atlantic Council, and I would say across all of American foreign policy, and that with our allies and partners. We are at an inflection point in global history, one that brings together historic shifts that we struggle to understand and manage. They include, one, a new era of major competition, major power competition. Second, an ongoing contest between democracy and autocracy, where democratic rights across the world, according to Freedom House, took another big hit in 2020 during COVID, after being in recession since 2006. Third, we face new questions regarding America's proper role in the world and how to execute it. And finally, we face new questions regarding the future of the global system of rules and institutions that have evolved since World War II. And that involves who will set the standards for our future, ranging from matters of human rights to matters of artificial intelligence. In the background, we are experiencing a technological revolution that is influencing every corner of our lives, from our health to our privacy to how we pay our bills, and mounting environmental challenges that will test our ability to cooperate globally, perhaps even more dramatically than the pandemic has done in the last year. And that's the context for this debate. Through debates like the one we're hosting today, the Atlantic Council seeks to promote an old-fashioned idea that helped make democracies stronger over time. And that is that lively discourse based on mutual respect and intellectual integrity is essential to our common future, to our search for solutions to generational challenges. This kind of debate is also in short supply. The Atlantic Council today brings together two Atlantic Council programs, our Eurasia Center and our New American Engagement Initiative, with differing views on how best to confront the challenges of an autocratic and revanchist Russia. The Atlantic Council's historic purpose is clear enough. How does one complete a Europe whole and free alongside our partners and allies, where Russia over time can find its peaceful and rightful place? How to work with our European allies and Russian friends to achieve that is far harder to discern. Our founding mission is shaping the global future alongside partners and allies. But with what tools and policies do we do that? The debate we're having today is not to score academic points on each other, although there will be some of that, but to find the most enduring, sustainable solutions to shape a better, more prosperous, peaceful, and free world. The Eurasia Center, under Director John Herbst, the former ambassador to Ukraine and Uzbekistan, has been one of the leading voices on Ukraine and Russia policy in the United States since Russia's annexation of Crimea and incursions in the Donbass in 2014. The Eurasia Center promotes American interests that strengthen stability, democratic values, and prosperity in Russia and across the region. Its approach is consistent with the traditions of the Atlantic Council over the past 60 years of working with allies and partners, of upholding human rights and democracy, and promoting stability in the broader region. The work of the New American Engagement Initiative is also consistent with the Atlantic Council's history of the past 6 decades. It was launched by the Atlantic Council last year to broaden the aperture of debate on such issues as Russia, understanding that we are facing a historic moment where the shifts we are undergoing demand more creative search for solutions and the testing of assumptions. Its analyst views have tended to be broadly consistent with the realist school of foreign policy, which emphasizes a balance between values and interests in foreign policy. Its two directors are Chris Preble and Matt Burrows. As I said, its approach is also consistent with our history. It's fitting that the NAEI is housed within the Scowcroft Center for Strategy. The center's namesake, General Brent Scowcroft, has often been associated with the realist worldview, as has our longest-serving board member, Henry Kissinger. It is important to note, however, that both Scowcroft and Kissinger understood that no U.S. foreign policy would be sustainable that didn't reflect U.S. democratic values and convictions. Indeed, Scowcroft, for more than 2 decades, was on the board of the International Republican Institute, a U.S. nonprofit committed to advancing freedom and democracy worldwide. Before launching this debate, let me tell you just one brief anecdote about General Scowcroft, the only man to have served 2 U.S. presidents as National Security Advisor and the guiding spirit of the Atlantic Council until his passing in August at age 95. In my conversation, in the last conversation I had with General Scowcroft before I left the Wall Street Journal to run the Atlantic Council, I reminded him that he and I had been on different sides of one of the most important post-Cold War debates facing the transatlantic community, and that was regarding NATO enlargement. I reminded him that I had been passionately for NATO enlargement while at the Wall Street Journal, and that he had been against. What would happen, I asked him, if we differed again on a matter of such central significance to the future of NATO, of Europe, and of US global commitment, and to the Atlantic Council? His answer was a simple one: make good arguments. So with that advice to our panelists, it's now my pleasure to pass the baton to our moderator, Jack Beecham, a senior correspondent at Vox Media, who will outline the rules of today's debate and introduce our panelists. Thank you all for tuning in. To those of you watching on Zoom, please join the discussion by submitting questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And to Zach and to our panelists, make good arguments. Zach, over to you.
Thanks, Fred. I really appreciate the introduction. And this is a really exciting and fun event. I'm honored to moderate. We've been calling it the Rumble in the Zoom Room, the Thrilla in Manila folders. We got a few names internally for the conversation we're about to have, but we have a great panel of thoughtful experts who are going to debate, I think, one of the foundational issues in American foreign policy as it relates to one of the most important countries in, well, the world. So we're going to go really quickly through all of their bios. I'm going to truncate it a little bit just to save us all some time. So on the New American Engagement Initiative team, we've got Emma Ashford and Matt Burrows. Dr. Ashford is a senior fellow. She and her team focus on recalibrating the core assumptions of American foreign policy and proposing new, more effective forms of American engagement in the world in close cooperation with U.S. allies and partners. She has expertise in the politics of Russia, Europe, and the Middle East, and previously worked at the Cato Institute and writes a lot of interesting things in publications like Vox, which, by the way, if you're not reading, I would encourage all of you to read. Dr. Burrows is the co-director of NAEI and the director of the Atlantic Council's Foresight, Strategy, and Risks Initiative. He's one of the leading experts on strategic foresight and global trend analysis, and had a distinguished 28-year career at the U.S. Department of State and the CIA. Now, on the other side, for the Eurasia team, we have Melinda Herring and Ambassador John Herbst. Melinda is the deputy director of the Eurasia Center and previously worked as the center's editor of the Ukraine Alert blog. She's a longtime observer of political developments in the Eurasia region, and her analysis has been featured in a lot of pretty impressive publications like the Washington Post and Foreign Affairs. John is the director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and previously served 31 distinguished years as a Foreign Service officer in the U.S. Department of State, retiring at the rank of career minister. He was the U.S. ambassador to Uzbekistan and Ukraine and received 2 Presidential Distinguished Service Awards during his diplomatic career. So now that we've introduced these people and you're suitably excited to see them go at it, I want to briefly go over the structure here because it's pretty important and very highly structured. At the start, I'm going to ask each speaker, excuse me, sorry, it's early in the morning, to present their opening statement. You have 4 minutes each. Now, following everyone's statement, we'll start the moderated debate period with the NAEI team for 8 minutes. I'll pose my own questions, and then Melinda will have 4 minutes to offer a direct rebuttal to their answers. Then I will turn to the Eurasia team, and I'll ask them questions for 8 minutes, and Emma will have 4 minutes to respond. Finally, John and Matt will deliver closing remarks, and then you'll get to ask questions. You can submit your questions through the event, and I will choose which to pose to the panelists. If your question's annoying, I will ignore it. If it's good, I will try to spotlight it. So I hope you know that. Now, that's everything that I wanted to talk about. I'm not the important person here. Our debaters are, and I think I'd like to get started hearing from them. With everything out of the way, Emma, you have 4 minutes for your opening remark.
Great, thanks, Zach. And thanks to everybody for attending this event and for your interest in what I think is a really important debate. And I also want to thank my colleagues for their willingness to engage in this conversation. So with regard to US Russia policy, I think this debate comes at a vital time. Each of the last 3 presidential administrations has come into office seeking to improve the US-Russian relationship, and each has left with the relationship in a worse place. This matters for the safety and security of Americans. I don't think I can put it any better than the authors of an open letter that was published last year in Politico. It was signed by over 100 former officials and experts on Russia, and as they described it, US-Russia relations are at a dangerous dead end that threatens the US national interest. And I think that is a very accurate description of the situation. The Biden administration has a window to try and change things, but that window is fast closing. And so in that context, I would suggest 3 problems with our current approach to Russia, and why we should de-emphasize human rights and democracy promotion in favor of more concrete interests. So first point, our one-size-fits-all approach to Russia with sanctions isn't working. And by that, I mean that we have a range of concerns with regard to Russia. Everything from domestic political crackdowns at one end of the spectrum through foreign arms sales, hacking, election meddling, the invasion of its neighbors, the development of new exotic weapons. And yet our response is always the same in recent years. It is sanctions. And I would argue that it is impossible to deter Russia from doing the critically important things that we really care about, like election meddling here in the United States, when we treat those exactly the same as we treat the less important things, such as Russian domestic crackdowns. If we respond to everything with sanctions, then it's really hard for us to deter Russia on the things we care about. A second point. The Cold War and post-Cold War confidence-building measures that we put in place to prevent conflict with Russia during the Cold War and afterwards, that's everything from arms control to track 2 dialogues, are declining or dead today. Only New START really remains. And I would argue that our excessive focus on human rights and democratization in recent years and the associated web of sanctions that has produced in many ways prevents us from working through these problems with Russia. So to the extent that there is pressure not to talk to Russia unless that country resolves its human rights concerns, we are making the world a less safe place. I would argue you don't do diplomacy with your allies, you do it with your adversaries. And we need to talk to Russia despite our concerns about human rights in that case. And then a third point. If the biggest strategic challenge that faces the United States in the coming decades is China, then it is truly baffling that we are choosing to drive Russia towards China in order to improve human rights in that country. So Russia and China have a long history of sometimes being confrontational, sometimes being, friendly towards each other. And I would argue that America needs to maintain its ability to insert friction into that relationship if we don't want the China-Russia relationship to become a stronger, more durable partnership. And again, here, prioritizing human rights, prioritizing democratization, and the associated sanctions infrastructure has been partly responsible for the growing ties between Moscow and Beijing in recent years. So I would argue that the bottom line is this. If we learned any lesson from the Cold War, it's that there is a balance to be struck between interests and human rights. We often have this very triumphalist view of the Cold War that suggests It was won by American pressure in favor of human rights and democratization. But I'd point out that the Cold War was as much shaped by the hard choices that American policymakers made on concrete interests, things like Nixon going to China or START and SALT. And so human rights aren't unimportant, but I'd argue that for the good of American interests, it must take second place. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Emma, for that excellent opening salvo. Now we're on to Melinda for her opening statement.
Thanks, Zach. It's great to be with you, Emma, Matt. Good morning, John. I'm going to start with a spoiler alert. There's a lot we agree on. There, I saved you a whole hour and one less Zoom meeting. You're so very welcome. To be serious, this debate comes down to how we define U.S. interests in Russia and how to best achieve those interests. It's also about our values and what we are prepared to do to promote and defend them. Both sides agree that Putin's behavior is awful, Russia's human rights record is appalling, and the U.S. should use its policies to pursue our interests. Ambassador Herbst and I argue that human rights are a vital part of U.S. foreign policy, but not the only element. And this is not a new position. The position that we're staking out here today is one that's consistent with U.S. foreign policy, and it's been consistent under Democrats and Republicans. Joe Biden, our new president, has said he will work with allies while increasing the costs on Russia. And this is exactly where the U.S. should be. Matt and Emma disagree, and they've written a paper that argues that the U.S. should focus on interests, not on human rights with Russia. There's a fundamental problem with their paper. They've set up a straw man. I don't recognize the opposing position that they describe in their paper. Few would argue for a human rights first approach outside a small group of vocal human rights organizations. Matt and Emma also argue for conceding the lever that drives Vladimir Putin crazy, which is our insistence that Russia abide by its stated human rights pledges even before we get to the negotiating table. Why on earth would you give up this point of leverage? It's like asking Superman to fight crime without his X-ray vision. Plus, the argument doesn't make any sense. As my colleague Dylan Miles-Primakoff points out, we can do both. We can strike deals and we can criticize. The Biden administration is doing this already. They imposed sanctions after the Russian government tried to kill Alexei Navalny, the leading opposition leader, while sealing a 5-year deal on New START. And Zach, this isn't the only example of our ability to do both. Number two, we see the nature of the regime so very differently. There are few policies that would convince Russia to stop interfering in US elections or heck, even British or Spanish elections. There are few policies that would convince the Russians to stop engaging in chemical weapon attacks on sovereign UK soil. Russia under Vladimir Putin is a thuggish, transactional, and thoroughly corrupt system that will cheat, lie, and steal for its advantage. I'm going to be really blunt. There are few US interests Russia is willing to work with us on. What are we going to get from Russia that's worth giving up our commitments to human rights? Number three, Matt and Emma seem to think that the US shouldn't promote democracy because Putin doesn't like it, and he might declare more people in organizations foreign agents. Colleagues, the Atlantic Council is already in a desirable location, and we aren't organizing revolution in Moscow. I am not directing street protests from my bathrobe in suburban Maryland. Building a policy around Vladimir Putin's fears and paranoia is a recipe for enabling him, not containing him. And the final problem, Emma and Matt argue that democratization in Russia wouldn't necessarily be good for US interests and would produce chaos. Sorry, but all people, including Russians, deserve a shot at democracy, and they get to decide their future, not think tank experts. Emma and Matt cite some research that says that a nation's foreign policy isn't altered after regime change. Well, in 1989, there was wide regime change in East and Central Europe, and it did change their foreign policy. Things seem to have gone pretty well there. In the 90s, Russia had regime change, and it didn't sling nukes. Regime change will come internally. Washington isn't going to topple Putin. What Putin fears are the legitimate democratic aspirations of his own people, and we should do everything we can to support and encourage them while still talking to Moscow. This is where our interests and values converge. Biden's approach is right. It's aspirational, but hard-nosed. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Melinda. Now, Matt, you have 4 minutes for your response.
Well, thank you. And, it's a really an honor to participate in this debate. I think Melinda has done us a real service in pointing out the several key points that really divide what Emma and I were saying and what John and Melinda believe. And the first one, she said basically that what are we going to give up by not, well, first of all, the core. You know, she said basically that human rights were not going to be at the core of US foreign policy, never had been. But we do have a statement from Secretary of State Blinken that says exactly that they want to put human rights at the core of US foreign policy. And the piece that we were writing was to remind the new administration that first, it's not likely, and I think Melinda concurred partially, that we could achieve that aim of changing other countries, other autocracies like Russia or China, by putting human rights at the center, making that the big objective for the US. That wasn't likely to be achieved. The second thing that she said was that we give up, there's nothing else that really matters in US relations with Russia. And I would dispute that, and it's something that we haven't touched on here yet. I think we actually have an opportunity to develop the arms control dialogues that the Trump administration gave up, and that we have a chance after Biden has agreed with Putin to extend New START for 5 years. I mean, we are, and Fred mentioned this in his statement, we are at a pivotal moment where we have a lot of new technologies that are potentially very destabilizing. We have no arms control dialogue that deals with the potential arms race in space or in the Arctic, or with automated weaponry or hypersonic weaponry, all of those forces in which we should really be having a dialogue with Russia. We haven't started, and that should be at the core. Now, we said in the statement that, you know, and we probably, the problem was that we didn't go on maybe and state all the areas that we really need to begin that dialogue. And the other thing that Emma just mentioned on Russia, China, there are experts in Russia who agree with us in getting China into the arms control dialogue. Now, obviously, you know, that's a way that maybe we can push a little wedge there between Russia and China. Try to get trilateral arms control dialogue going. Now we should state here that one other difference is that both Emma and I don't believe that conflict, the potential for conflict, is all that insignificant. I mean, I think, are at risk unlearning the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis. If we don't put in some guide posts here, some guide rails and guardrails to prevent what could be an escalation into much more dangerous level of conflict. I do not believe that Biden administration wants that, or Russia or China, but that is the potential there. Final remark.
Time. I'm sorry.
Okay, why did I leave it for the next round?
Oh yeah, I'll have plenty of questions for you. John, you're up.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to thank Matt and Emma for joining us in this conversation. Of course, it's always great to go into a fight with Melinda. Look, I agree with Matt and Emma that our policy towards Russia is not just about, and should not just be about, human rights. Our principal interest in connection with Russia is to stop its assault on the international liberal order, to stop its aggression in Europe. It is conducting 2 wars. It's conducted 2 wars in Europe for the first time since the end of World War II. A major power has been fighting wars in Europe, and we need to stop them. That's our principal interest. That does not mean, however, that we don't have an interest in the conversation with Moscow about arms control and other matters. But this conversation is about values and human rights. And here's something that's very, very important. Values are not just a reflection of who we are as a society, they are a critical asset for us internationally. The United States is at the center of a web of relations, alliances, partnerships, the international system, which is based upon our values. We have allies, right? We have our NATO allies. It's a democratic club. Our partners with the European Union, another democratic club. We are partners with Japan and with Canada and with Australia. All democracies, all with major economies. And they increase our security, they increase our power, they increase our influence. Russia and China have no real allies, unless you count North Korea for China. That's because their systems are not based upon values that can attract people. And there's a definite connection between Russia's domestic policy, it's basically a kleptocratic autocracy, and its revanchist foreign policy. If Moscow was able to attract its neighbors, if it was able to pull them towards it because of the value of the values that it practices, it would not need to use coercion. The frozen conflict policy Moscow put in place the first days after the Soviet Union fell because it was unable to attract the former parts of the Soviet Union into a close relationship with itself. So the United States pushing on human rights, pushing on values, is reminding the Russians of their vulnerability and also attracting those in Russia's neighborhood. This is an important part of our power, and we should understand that. It's not just a matter of values, it's a matter of our power. Now, I agree with Emma that our sanctions policy has been indiscriminate. I would disagree with her that our major interest with Russia is persuading them to stop meddling in our elections. We can take care of our elections despite their meddling. Our principal objective with Moscow is to stop its revisionist assault on the international order. And for that reason, we need to defeat Moscow or help Ukraine defeat Moscow in Donbass so that Kremlin provocations against our allies in the Baltic states will not increase. That's our principal interest, and our sanctions policy should be focused first and foremost on that. But for that policy to be effective, we also have to make it clear to Moscow, if its aggression ceases, the sanctions go away. The unfortunate practice that happened with the Jackson-Vanik sanctions needs to be wiped off the map so that Russia has an incentive. Now, Matt made the point that we have an interest, and Emma did too, in preventing the emergence of a Chinese-Russian entente. I agree with that. But the way to do that is not to appease Moscow by letting it rough and roughshod over its neighbors. It's to push back hard on Moscow as it does that, and to remind the Russians that they share this long border with China, that China did not treat Moscow particularly well when Russia approached China following our sanctions in 2014 and 2015 and wanted to build a pipeline for gas to the east. And let me give a Chinese lesson for our audience. Forgive me if I mispronounce this word, but remember this word, Haishin Wei.
That's time.
Haishin Wei is the Chinese word for Vladivostok, and the Chinese even today are challenging Russian rule there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for that commentary, and everyone for your strong opening statements. Now I get to talk, which is exciting for me as a podcast host, among other things. But I'm first going to talk to Emma and Matt about their arguments. And actually, I want to start by picking up on the sort of big structuring point of John's comments there, which is imagining the US-Russia relationship as fundamentally set by Russia's revisionist meddling with the international order, right? Do you agree that that's the United States' primary, or should be the US's primary objective in its relations with Russia? And if you do, then how could you possibly remove human rights pressure from that sort of broader ideological frame?
So I'll address this first and then let Matt weigh in if he wants. I would raise sort of 2 points about that. So the first is that I think, John's characterization of Russian activities in the Donbass and eastern Ukraine as more important than election meddling here in the US is a very profoundly problematic way of conceptualizing US interests. US foreign policy is about serving the interests of the American population, about providing peace and prosperity here at home for Americans. And I would argue that there's almost nothing more fundamental to that than our system of government. And so, I find it, somewhat problematic to suggest that Russia's actions thousands of miles away in a country that's not an ally of the US, that's not a NATO member, is more problematic. And then I'll raise, I guess, a second point, which is revisionism or revanchism, as political scientists conceptualize the idea, it just means that a state is trying to change some aspect of the international order. But we often act with Russia and with China as if this is an all or nothing proposition, that they're out to topple the US, change the whole world. In fact, in reality, it's far more likely that Russia is trying to change the facts on the ground in its neighboring states in eastern Ukraine. It's not necessarily clear that it has intentions past that point. And again, this gets to the question of what are critical US interests. And I would argue that what Russia is doing in eastern Ukraine is not a critical interest for the United States. It's not part of some broader assault that we really need to be worried about.
Matt, do you have anything to add?
Or just to say, I mean, this gets back to this inflection point. I mean, we talk about this as the international order as if we own it. We don't own it. We are living in a world in which in 2 or 3 years' time, China is going to be a bigger economic power than the US. We've got to get used to a multipolar world. And that means knowing how to live with diversity.
So I want to pick up on what was essentially a moral argument embedded in what Emma was just saying, which is that American interests are determined primarily, or rather should be the key determinant of American foreign policy. I think that's debatable, to put it mildly. It seems that there's an implicit moral calculus that the US government has some kind of overriding obligation to its own citizens that allows it to ignore the lives of foreigners functionally, right? That when there may be some kind of trade-off between what's narrowly good for US power positioning, or even like minor infringements on the American electoral system, there's very little evidence that Russian election interference changed the course of the US election in 2016 or significantly compromised the fairness of the competition. But you do have Ukrainians dying, right? You have Ukrainians dying. You have the risk of Russian involvement in NATO states, if it wants to push that far, triggering a wider war. You have Syrians who have been slaughtered by their proxy, the Assad regime in this case. How can you make the argument that fairly narrow and limited American interests where direct lives aren't at stake outweigh large-scale human suffering abroad?
I'll begin on this one. I guess one answer, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. I mean, we've been there. I mean, this is a hard truth. Nobody likes to deny, that we would like to go out there, be Superman, and correct all the world's ills. But the fact is that we have to learn with some limitations. We also have to learn that some of our actions, good intentions, like with Iraq, with Afghanistan, actually led to some huge human rights disasters in those countries. So first off, and also take some lessons from the past. During the Cold War, we couldn't help Hungary and Czechoslovakia. We knew what our limitations are. And that is part of this governing. It's not as if we don't sympathize and we wouldn't want to do, but we also have to know what our limitations are.
Yeah, and I'll just add, it is an ethical consideration. And, we often, there's this discussion that realists, or this impression that realists don't have ethics. But if you go back to the classical realist authors, they talked about how policymakers have a responsibility to those that elected them to ensure the safety and security and prosperity of Americans. And, if you don't think that election meddling is a big enough interest or important enough to American lives, then how about nuclear weapons, right? We have a really strong interest in arms control, and we are facing an arms control environment with new proliferating, destabilizing weapons platforms. We have a really strong interest in protecting the security of Americans here at home by talking to Russia.
And the last question I want to ask before we start running low on time, and to give you sufficient time to answer it, is that your argument fundamentally rests on this idea that there's a trade-off between human rights pressure and progress on other issues. But there are a lot of examples, both in US-Russia and US-Soviet relations, but also broader US relations with other countries where we've put human rights pressure on them in one area, or pressure or created tension in certain areas of the relationship. Here, you can look at Iran as a good example here, and still manage to make progress on other fronts, right? We can argue and fight with Iran about, let's say, Syria or Israel, while at the same time concluding the Iran nuclear deal. With Russia, you can look at the Reagan administration's diplomacy in the Soviet era, right? It seems like there are a lot of examples historically of human rights pressure co-traveling or otherwise foreign policy disagreements co-traveling with progress on core interests of both countries. So why is there this linkage that you propose?
Well, I think you're not reading the piece closely enough. I mean, we talked about denouncing human rights. We did not say that this wasn't going to be an objective, but it wasn't, and we were reacting to administration rhetoric, as I've already said, which has made a big deal about making this the core of their policy. So yes, I would agree that states have work on different levels, but the piece was written to remind that our real interest is basically on getting arms control going, on getting some stability into the relationship, not resetting it by any means.
Yeah, just to add to this, I think there is a slightly deeper point here, right? Because you could, I think, make the argument that we've been able to make some progress on things like, we renewed New START with Russia, even though we are pushing on human rights issues. But there's this deeper question of the extent to which we can really achieve anything with Russia, to which we can stabilize the relationship, so long as the Kremlin effectively believes that we are trying to topple that regime. And pushing on human rights, pushing on sanctions is part of the problem there. And so our argument is not that you can't make any progress if you continue to push on human rights. It's that if we backed off a little on human rights, we might have better luck stabilizing this relationship and achieving more of our interests.
Melinda, you now have 4 minutes for a rebuttal before I turn my fire on YouTube.
Awesome. Thank you, Zach. Thanks, Emma and Matt. Okay, on Eastern Ukraine and election interference, I think you're mischaracterizing our position. Ending election interference is super important. But again, there are few policies that will change Russia's calculus. Russia is interfering in elections around the world. I would love to know what policies you think would change Russia's calculus on this. Russia thinks it can break the rules without any consequences. On Ukraine, Ukraine wants to be an ally. It's not unimportant. It's on the front line of freedom, and it wants to join Europe, and it's working damn hard to do it. And we should give them all the credit and all the resources that they need. On nukes, you still haven't answered my argument. How have sanctions prevented progress, or how have the Navalny sanctions prevented progress on nukes? We just cut a deal with START between 2013 and 2015. Even as relations were falling apart over Ukraine, we worked constructively with Russia on the Iran deal. It's possible to do both. Russia, we don't have to have a warm, wonderful relationship. You can still cut deals. Number 3, Iraq and Afghanistan are fundamentally different than the US position in Ukraine, and it doesn't even make sense to compare these things. It's apples and oranges. And then 4, I appreciate Matt saying, let's go back to the Cold War and mind the history there. There's a lot of examples that we can take there. We need to be talking to the Russians. I absolutely agree with Emma. We need to be talking to the Russian government and Russian civil society. The Russian government doesn't want us to talk to Russian civil society. We did this constantly during the Cold War. Talk to both. We need to continue to boost and support independent media in Russia, especially Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. We did this during the Cold War. RFERL's service in Russia is under fire, and we need to continue to back them verbally. We also need to go back to the Cold War when we challenged Russia to live up to its stated constitution. Russia claims to be a democracy. Putin doesn't claim to be a thug and an autocrat, which he is. We need to challenge them to live up to their stated commitments. One of the best policies we had during the Cold War was to insist that the Soviet Union live up to its constitution, which includes freedom of press and freedom of assembly. So that's it. Thanks, Zach.
Excellent. Thank you for being succinct, and now we can have a lovely conversation on our side. So you brought up the Cold War, and let's talk about that, because I think there's a really excellent episode that illustrates Matt and Emma's point about the trade-off between human rights sanctions, which is the Jackson-Vanik Act, right? Like, Jackson-Vanik seems to have, at least in some ways, maybe arguably accomplished its goal, original goal, of increasing Jewish emigration from the Soviet Union, where they were being persecuted. But there's also very good reason to think that its passage in '74 fatally undermines the Nixon-Kissinger détente approach, right? That it convinced the Soviet leadership that the Americans weren't serious in terms of actually working with them, that Nixon didn't have the ability to put interests ahead coldly of domestic passions that he thought he did. It seems that there you can isolate a really clear trade-off between overemphasis on foreign policy, overemphasis on human rights, and an inability to pursue core American objectives of diplomatic rapprochement with Russia. What makes you think that our current approach won't repeat the failures of Jackson-Vanik?
If I could jump in here, I actually disagree with your interpretation of Jackson-Vanik. Yes, Jackson-Vanik did achieve its objective of helping increase emigration for Soviet Jewry. But it's also true that after Jackson-Vanik was passed, of course, we all know Nixon left the White House in 1974, and Ford took over. And Ford had a successful summit on arms control issues with Brezhnev, which I believe, in Vladivostok, I believe in 1976. So we were able to pursue arms control with Russia, even as we nailed them on human rights issues. So I think that example is how you can do both.
So more broadly, when we're thinking about the policy toolkit right now available to the United States, we've talked a lot about sanctions today, and basically everybody agrees that sanctions are not changing Russian behavior right now. And more broadly, the literature on sanctions is not promising in terms of trying to change, like get a regime to change its fundamental behavior, right? Like basically all of the large N evidence we have suggests that non-targeted sanctions don't work. And even targeted sanctions can only have a limited effect, and certainly not when a regime's core interests are at stake, right? So if it is the case that the Putin regime is fundamentally premised on repression and abuse of its own people, and that's how the government manages to maintain its hold on power, what tools does the US have that could override the emphasis, the importance of repression in the Russian political system?
Zach, I think both of us want to take a swing at this one. John's going to defend sanctions, and I'll talk about the other tools. So one, we need to talk to both the Russian government and Russian civil society and look for areas where our values and interests converge. We need to continue to boost RFERL and independent media in Russia. Number three, we need to change our laws so Russians can't launder their dirty money through our system. And we also need to pressure London to change its laws. John and I favor tougher conditional sanctions, and he'll explain that in a minute. But I do want to stress one point. I think Emma and Matt are right to point out that sanctions are not a panacea, and that if Russian behavior changes, they should be removed. We need to be better at pulling them back if there is behavioral change. Number five, policy makers should look at visa bans on top Russian officials and their children. And number six, again, we need to challenge them to live up to their stated commitments. Go ahead, John.
On sanctions, I think there's a great deal of confusion. To my mind, sanctions have three purposes. The first and the hardest to achieve is to persuade a country to reverse a policy that's put in place. The second is to deter that country from repeating that policy elsewhere. And the third is to put a price on that country for pursuing baleful policies. If you look at our sanctions on Russia, they certainly have not achieved the first objective, which is get Russia to change its behavior. But I think there are times during the crisis in Ukraine where the possibility of additional sanctions deterred Moscow from escalation. And certainly sanctions have been spectacular in the third category. If you believe, as I think we've established, that Moscow is pursuing a revisionist policy, which is very dangerous to American interests, the fact that our sanctions are costing the Russian economy 1 to 1.5% of GDP per year means that they have fewer resources with which to pursue that baleful policy, that dangerous policy. So from that point of view, our sanctions policy has been very successful. But Melinda's right. We agree with Matt and Emma that we should be able to remove sanctions as Russian policy moves in the right direction. And we should make that clear. As for the concept of conditional sanctions, to deter Moscow, for example, right now, they are threatening additional escalation in Ukraine. We should lay out conditional sanctions that would go into place if Moscow, in fact, tries to seize Mariupol or tries to seize the water canal north of Crimea. My personal recommendation would be that we go after Vnesheconombank, a major state bank in Russia, making sure that it cannot participate in the international system. That would be a serious disincentive to Moscow to escalate in Ukraine.
So I want to pick up on Matt's point about multipolarity, right? In a world where the US has less international influence and concomitantly China's influence is growing, especially in the economic area, it seems that even those targeted sanctions or the more sophisticated ones that you're describing that we should layer on or potentially think about as additional measures are less likely to be effective in a world where you have basically an authoritarian economic backstop that can fill in if the US is pursuing a more ideological human rights focused policy. And that the more China's influence grows, the harder it will be for the US to sort of unilaterally set the course of the global financial system. Do you think that analysis is wrong? That the US is still so important that there's nothing China can do if we really want to sanction Russia, or what?
Lynn, do you want to try that first?
No, you're the China guy. You go ahead.
Okay, all right. Look, there's no question that American power, which peaked after World War II, has been in relative terms diminishing ever since. And that continues today. And the rise of China is the single most important manifestation of that. But it's also true, if you understand the United States as at the center of a global community of democracies and of advanced economies, that global community is far more powerful in all ways than China is. And it's critical for us, I believe, to maintain the rules that were established since the end of World War II, rules which have enabled not just the United States and our partners to prosper, but all countries, our former enemies, our former competitors, to prosper so long as they enter that system and play by the rules. After World War II, we invited Japan and Germany into this club, and they prospered. After the end of the Cold War, Russia and China received the same invitation, and China especially has taken advantage of it. But when we talk about multipolarity, understand that Chinese rules, as they've laid them out, are not Western rules, and they're not rules that are attractive to other people. As I mentioned earlier, China has no real allies. And China's behavior over the past 10 or 12 years, assertive, revisionist, has frightened countries which otherwise would have been appalled by the incompetence of American foreign policy in this century. Matt and Emma are right that our misadventures in the Middle East were a disaster for a whole variety of reasons. Yet despite that, the countries, especially in the Far East, which looked at those policies with contempt, have come back to the United States because they are afraid of a rising China. China, which when it establishes economic arrangements, sends its workers there to the countries with which they establish those economic relations. That uses debt to take control of countries. These are not the open policies which our international system, the system we helped create, has established. And the whole world understands that. So yes, we have to allow for the rise of China, but we very much want to mute what that means. And we would do that not just for our own interest, but for the interest of most countries around the world.
That's great. Thank you, John. And thank you, Melinda. Now, Emma, you've got 4 minutes for a rebuttal.
Great, thanks. And thanks to everybody for your really great arguments. So I'm just going to rebut sort of a few quick points. To Melinda's point about Ukraine, we've largely stayed away from the question of Ukraine in this debate because we're talking values and interests, but Melinda is making, I think, the argument that Ukraine is a values question. She said Ukraine is at the front of freedom and we should support them. And I think that there's two big problems with that argument. The first is that talking about Ukraine as if the US was obligated to defend it in many ways actually weakens and muddies our commitment to those countries that are actually members of NATO. By creating dubiety about what the US is willing to defend, we make conflict more likely and we make it harder to deter Russia again on those countries where we are actually obligated to defend them. And then a second point is that this is effectively a trade-off. Again, this is an ethical question. We are trading American security interests for the rights of Ukrainians. And you're talking about prioritizing American security as less than the rights of foreigners. And I consider that to be an unacceptable ethical trade-off. This is a place where I think we may differ, but I'm not sure we can reconcile it. On Melinda's point about we are making progress, we've made progress with New START, we've made progress with the Iran deal. That is true. We have made some progress. But again, Matt and I did not argue in this paper that we have made no progress. We have managed to do the things that are low-hanging fruit. But there are other places where cooperation with Russia or even just talking to them has died. Several arms control deals, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, for example, have died over the last few years. The Trump administration withdrew from a couple. And we largely have stopped talking to the Trump administration since, to the Kremlin since the Trump administration came into office in 2016. And I would argue that this is dangerous. It's not necessarily the things we have achieved that prove that human rights don't get in the way. It's the things we haven't achieved that prove that they might. A third point, Melinda's point that human rights is leverage. It pokes Putin in the eye and makes him crazy. Why would we give it up? Well, if it's leverage, we should use it. Leverage is no use if we don't use it. So we should think about what that leverage can actually be used to achieve. And if we can talk about dialing down pressure on some of these human rights or pro-democracy issues in exchange for achieving the interests that we really need to achieve with Russia, then I would argue that that is a net win for the United States. On the fourth point, John's point about regime change. So this gets into an argument that we made in the paper about, we should be aware that regime change in Russia, that the democratization in Russia would not necessarily be good for US interests. And it might be good for US interests, but Matt and I were making the point that equally it might not be good for US interests. And I would just say that the argument that regime change at the fall of the Soviet Union did not cause chaos in Russia is a very charitable reading of the situation. If you look at the 1990s, if you look at the immiseration that many average Russians suffered during that period, it was not a period that was without a lot of strife in Russia and in the international system. And I think more importantly, the point is that regime change didn't cause changes in foreign policy. Russia technically democratized, then it went backwards. And we have been throughout that period dealing with a Russia that has broadly the same interests as it did during the Soviet period. So our argument that regime change wouldn't change things, I think, is sort of a counterpoint there. I see that I am out of time, so I will turn this over.
Yes, thank you, Emma. And now, John, you have 4 minutes for your closing arguments.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Emma, for that. First of all, I want to clarify regarding my comments on meddling in US elections. Of course, the integrity of our elections is critical. My point is, yes, we should talk to the Russians about stopping it, but two, we have the means to stop it even despite their meddling. And whereas if Russia decides to use its army in Ukraine, we have far fewer means to stop it. Okay, now regarding Ukraine, this is not just a matter of values, it's a matter of interest. Moscow's assault on Ukraine is an assault, again, on security in Europe. And the best way to defend our allies in the Baltic states is to make sure that Moscow does not win in Ukraine. And we are not talking about sending American soldiers to die for Ukrainian soldiers. We're talking about sanctions. We're talking about providing weapons to Ukraine. We're talking about taking diplomatic steps to make Moscow's mission there more difficult. And there's clearly evidence that if Moscow would succeed in Ukraine, that it might move beyond. A Russian political analyst, Dmitry Trenin, who's very much within the bubble of accepted thought in Moscow, has argued that Moscow should demonstrate to the West that it has no ambitions beyond Ukraine and say that it would not touch American interests not touch the Baltic states. He made that appeal a few years ago after Trump won. Moscow is yet to operate on Trenin's recommendations. And Moscow's provocations against the Baltic states and Poland continue. Okay. I agree with Matt and Emma regarding our terrible policies in the Middle East, our failed policy in the Middle East, driven by idealism but not sufficiently realistic. But our policies in Ukraine are very different from our policies, whether it's in Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, or Iraq. Ukraine is able to organize an effective defense of its own country. It simply needs help. We had no real allies to work with who are competent in the greater Middle East. Okay, on China and Russia. The single best way to deal with the rise of China is to make it clear that revisionism by Russia also does not work. At the same time, we let the Russians know we're willing to work with them to help deal with their Chinese problem. Even today, when Russia and China are working together against us, Chinese diplomats have talked about Vladivostok as a Chinese city. Chinese media, Chinese academics have talked about this. The Chinese are laying a marker for what they will do in the future when they no longer need Russia to work against the United States. There are Russians who understand this. And we should be clear with Moscow that we're willing to help Moscow deal with that problem using the same principles we use to defend Ukraine against Kremlin revisionism. Exactly the same principles relating to territorial integrity. And finally, let's not have a caricature of Melinda and my position. We believe human rights are important. We believe we have an interest stake in Ukraine, but we also believe that as we pursue these policies, we should be talking to Moscow about arms control issues, perhaps about dealing with terrorism, perhaps about dealing with narcotics, and certainly about dealing with the Chinese. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, John. That was great. And again, thank you for being timely. We're really moving along here in this debate. Matt, you have 4 minutes for your closing statement.
Okay, I think I'd like to try to summarize where we are. I think, there are some areas where we agree. I don't think either side likes Putin or the fact that there are huge violations of human rights. And certainly Emma and I in our piece talked about why we should be denouncing them. Where we have more differences, I think, is that for us at this moment, we should really be pushing on finding ways of dialoguing with Russia on the key arms control areas that could prove to escalate existing tensions to a higher level of conflict. Secondly, I dispute and continue to dispute our ability to bring democracy or human rights in countries like Russia. I think we have a bad track record to begin with, but if you look at, most of the reason why democracies become democracies is an internal domestic issue. And we shouldn't persuade ourselves that we have the ability to make those big changes. We have a couple of examples where we can tilt the balance, but nothing more. And to make that the core, I think, as I've stated a couple of times, is a huge mistake. The other areas, the overuse of sanctions, I think what we're seeing is the result is now with Chinese developing their digital currency, that really you are going to see the development of an alternative international financial system. And that, I think, it really undermines US power. And it is directly related to the overuse of sanctions by the US. We're up to over 1,600 sanctions that we have. Final thing on John's point of a community of democracies, which I would counsel not putting a huge amount of emphasis on. Most of the countries of those democracies have stronger economic ties with China than they do with the US. And that is something that is far different from what it was in the Cold War, where the Soviet Union was not an economic power, an international economic power in any sense. Basically, even though they complain about China in Asia, they're worried about a dominant China. Nevertheless, they know that economically, they still highly depend on China. They do not want to choose between the US and China, but forced to choose, some of them are actually going to go and choose China because basically their economies depend upon trade and investment from China. If we really, I think, wanted to get going on democracy and human rights, we would go into development in a way that we haven't been. I mean, this is basically the attraction of China and now to an extent of Russia in a lot of developing areas. They are the ones that are coming in. Yes, it's very conditioned, or less conditioned assistance than we would offer, but nevertheless, it fulfills their crying needs. We were very slow on the vaccine diplomacy, whereas China, even Russia, saw that as very important for their power. I think
we're at time, Matt.
Okay, and
you can say one more thing. Go ahead.
Finally, just to thank everybody, I think we had a very good debate.
I agree. Thanks to all the panelists, Matt, Emma, Melinda, John. You were all wonderful. But before we get too much into the pay-ins to everyone's interesting performance and arguments, I want to turn to the audience for a few questions. We've gotten some very interesting ones. The first one I want to look at is from Ambassador Richard Morningstar, who asks, how does advocacy for democracy and human rights relate to regime change? How can we differentiate between the two? And if a country such as Russia thinks rightly or wrongly that we are advocating regime change, will they ever listen on democracy and human rights? This is a question to both sides. So anyone who wants to take it, please do.
I'll jump in first here. So obviously these things are not the same, right? We know that they are not the same. Unfortunately, US foreign policy in the last couple of decades has done, I think, a very bad job of persuading most authoritarian leaders that the US isn't actually trying to overthrow their regimes. So I know Melinda says you can't compare the Middle East to Europe, but actually a lot of leaders, including we have some evidence that the Vladimir Putin himself has watched what the US did in the Middle East and taken lessons from it. Things like, leaders are at risk of regime change. We know that Putin is worried about sort of these color revolutions in the near abroad, as the Russians call it. So we have created a situation where, our sort of more benign support for NGOs, for civil society in a lot of these states looks far more threatening to authoritarian leaders than it used to. And I would argue that it's not particularly clear to me how we get past that moment, but it is a problem that we ourselves have created, and we need to think about how it's impacting our interests.
We ourselves have not created this problem. This is Putin's paranoia. And again, we cannot create policies based on Putin's paranoia. The idea that the United States was in Kyrgyzstan, in Georgia, and Ukraine, organizing revolution is a joke. Look at anything the US government does. It's incompetent. There's no way that we could organize color revolutions in complicated parts of Eurasia. Give me a break.
All right, our next question is for Emma and Matt from Deborah Kagan. And she asks, I have to ask, who cares whether Russia loves us? Why the overwhelming need to let Russia set the rules of the game and have the US acquiesce? Do the realists think that placating them actually works? Question mark.
I don't think we're placating Russia. What we are saying is that we need to talk with them. We don't have many channels of communication. A lot of those were eliminated in the Trump years, certainly on arms control. This is developing those channels, finding ways in which our interests overlap. I would not call that placating Russia. This is basically serving our interests, that we don't want to get into a larger conflict.
Zach, do you mind if I jump in? Just a quick one. We absolutely agree. We want to talk to the Russians. John and I can't say this enough. Emma and Matt are totally right. Let's talk. But there's a big problem in the Biden administration. We do not have a senior director for Russia. Everything is blowing up right now, and we need someone with expertise. If the Biden administration can't find a new face, call Obama's old Russia senior director. She's fabulous, and she can do a bang-up job. There's a big hole right now at the NSC.
And we personally would love to talk to Russia at the Atlantic Council, but they've labeled us an undesirable organization because they don't like our arguments.
Well, I like your arguments. So the next question is actually for Melinda and John. Now, James Joyner asks that Ambassador Herbst correctly notes that U.S. values are an asset and that Russia's are a liability in its relations with other nations. But why isn't that a point in Matt and Emma's favor? Why would you interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake?
I don't think that reminding and I would not call Russia an enemy, I'd call them a competitor or an opponent. I think that pushing on values and also criticizing Russia for human rights violations very much plays to our strength. And maybe it even promotes forced errors on the part of the Kremlin as they respond. I mean, frankly, the Kremlin was crazy from a realpolitik point of view to have jailed Navalny. They should have simply not allowed entry into Russia. But their brutal response to Navalny is another indication of their the flaws in their system. And it further delegitimizes their policy, even among those who like to get along with them, like the Putin verstehers in Germany.
So next question's for Emma and Matt from Ambassador Daniel Fried. He asks, didn't the Biden administration extend New START without linking it to human rights or Ukraine? And isn't that an example of pursuing arms control interests? Why can't the US take such steps while also pursuing human rights issues? That was, after all, the basis for Secretary Shultz's Soviet policy. So the whole argument that Biden is pursuing human rights first seems wrong.
So I think we've covered this a little already, but I think the Biden team was right to seize the New START extension, but that was the low-hanging fruit, the lowest of low-hanging fruit. It needed to be extended. It needed to be extended quickly. And frankly, given how the Biden team is handling some other issues, it's not clear to me that they would have done it if the time crunch hadn't been just so acute on that question. I still think the question is not the few opportunities that we've managed to seize, but the many opportunities to talk to Russia and try and push forward on other issues that we have sacrificed. And it seems to me, listening to Melinda and John talking about their proposed policy approach to Russia, more sanctions, pumping up Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, these seem like they're going to worsen the situation. They seem like they're doubling down on an approach that really hasn't worked already, instead of trying to see if there are ways that we could actually stabilize this relationship.
The next question is from Matthew Wasensky for John and Melinda, and he asks, how can the United States effectively pursue human rights and sovereignty issues in Ukraine without the support of a united European Union bloc? We know that Western Europe does not view Ukraine with the same priorities as Eastern Europe or the United States.
Melinda, you want to try that?
I think we are doing that already. The United States has been vigorous in its support for Ukraine. Yes, we need our allies, but the U.S. has been increasing support both for defensive weapons and for civil society programs. I think the Biden administration is going to do a lot of work behind the scenes to try to bring Germany and France back on board. And hopefully the Biden administration is going to play a greater role in trying to get in the negotiations in the Donbass?
That
I could just
was our last question. We're out of time, and I don't want to take any more of this distinguished panel's time. I want to thank everybody, Emma, John, Matt, and Melinda, for a really excellent conversation. We really got into the details of the policy issues, cutting through both the stereotype depictions of the other side and the sort of general cant that often surrounds US foreign policy debate into a really serious conversation about how to understand and reformulate US foreign policy given the way that Russia has evolved over the course of time. So this has been really great, and also a really civil conversation on an issue that can get really heated. So I really want to thank the panelists, and I hope all of you in the audience will give a virtual round of applause. I don't really know how to do that on a Zoom panel, but I'll clap for everybody and say thank you, and we hope that you come by for the next Atlantic Council conversation on similar issues.